Thank you for tuning in to the Christian Libertarian Podcast, Episode 4. Appreciate you listening, and I hope you enjoy. The first story I wanted to cover, it kind of made some rounds earlier today. It wasn't a huge news story, but something I wanted to touch on because it kind of harks back to an olden time thing, and I'll get into that in a minute. So the story that was circulating is that there was a young individual who was flying from Gainesville, Florida to Charlotte, North Carolina. But the way he got back there wasn't the standard, hey, direct flight to and from, the place. What he did was he purchased a ticket that was from Gainesville to New York City, which had a layover in Charlotte, and then just got off. That was the plan. The American Airlines agent somehow figured out he was from North Carolina, didn't let him board. They knew he was going to do it. He didn't have a checked bag, and they didn't let him go. And this kind of was a big deal. So I'll go into a little bit of it. So the term is called skiplagging, which is essentially, hey, look, if let's say there's a ton of flights from LA to New York that stop, that are decently priced, but let's say you don't want to go to New York. Let's say you're in LA and you want to go to like Kansas City, and one of the layovers happens to be in Kansas City. Great. Now that typically wouldn't make sense flying from LA to New York. You'd think would be more expensive than flying LA to Kansas City. Well, oftentimes you'd find that, hey, with that layover, it's cheaper to just do that whole flight versus flying just direct to Kansas City. It's a concept, and I'll get in a little bit how this is actually not the first time that something like this has happened. So a lot of people were coming out in defense of the individual, the child who I think he was 15, 16 years old. The situation was rectified. I mean, the parents just bought a direct flight from Gainesville to Charlotte, or maybe at a layover or something, where the destination that was on the tickets that were on the ticket were actually Charlotte. So he got back. So, he's safe. Nothing worry there. But it brings up an interesting point that the question is, I guess, a lot of people are asking, and if you read the comment sections, you see the reaction to the story is, one, the people are asking, hey, why do airlines care if people do this? And second of all, how is it moral to charge more for a shorter flight than for a longer flight? So I'll tackle the first one so why would airlines, charge less for a flight? So, that went longer, has a layover than just a direct flight to that city. Well, the first thing is that, you think about airlines, they have hubs. So Delta, I believe, is in Atlanta. American Airlines is Dallas, Fort Worth Airport, and each of the major airlines has their hub. I think United might be, Chicago, could be mistaken on that. But, all the major airlines do, and before they were kind of consolidated, you had like Continental had theirs, and, whatever, and then they consolidated, and you have these airports, and there are minor hubs and whatnot. And so, it really makes sense that you would have a layover at one of these hubs. So let's say you're flying west to east on American Airlines. It makes sense that you're going to stop in DFW. Why does it make sense? Well, one, it's halfway across the country. Let's say you're flying, from LA to New York, let's say in this instance, and you stop at DFW Airport. They can transport people from LA to DFW, and then from DFW, they could, maybe 10 people from that flight are going to like Orlando, 20 to New York City, 20 to Charlotte. Likewise, it's not just people from LA flying in. You have people from San Diego, Portland, Oregon, Denver, Colorado, whatever. And so it's a really easy way to maximize, flights being full and, moving across there. So if you think about the hub, infrastructure, it would make sense in that regard. So then you can, get that. So if you have a hub as a layover, it makes sense. And I think Charlotte might be a hub for one of these, or I don't know in this case. The other thing is crew flexibility. So let's say, you have a crew that, you want your crew in your hub, so then you have the most flights entering and exiting your hub, which means you have a lot more flexibility. If someone's sick, if someone's, has an issue, you can easily find a replacement person because, you have a lot more people on call there. So it's easier there. Some other reasons, maybe it's easier to refuel in a hub. Certainly, you have more resources there, so it's centralized. And so that would be the airline's argument for that. Another argument that the airline could make is that you have a situation where they actually subsidize the flights from, let's say, LA to New York to compete, but then, let's say not too many people are competing in the other space. Like, let's say in this case, it was from Gainesville to Charlotte, North Carolina. Maybe not too many people service that flight. And that is really the crux of the second point, or the second argument that people were making against airlines, is how is it morally justifiable to charge a lot more for a shorter flight than it is a longer flight? And the reality is it has to do with competition, right? If, how many airlines are really servicing Gainesville, Florida to Charlotte, or let's say Salt Lake City to New Orleans, or, Memphis, Tennessee to Detroit, or, some of these smaller ones. And those are still major cities. I mean, think about, let's say Dallas, major airport to Amarillo. Maybe there's only a couple of airlines that do that flight. And so there's not a ton of competition in those areas. But a ton of airlines are going to compete in the major ones. So obviously going in and out of like New York City, Los Angeles, Dallas, Chicago, the major cities are going to have a lot more competition. And so the flight LA to New York, it's probably the most traveled, I would guess, flight, or maybe something to Dallas. But there's a ton of flights LA to New York, right? Maybe there's some stuff where you don't necessarily see that on the screens, because in LA it's like, oh, you're getting, you have a layover in Chicago, you have a layover in Dallas, Houston, Atlanta, Charlotte, wherever. But the final destination of a lot of these flights is to New York City. And it makes sense because it's, a bunch of people travel. It's two major cities. But here's the thing. You have a ton of airlines competing in that space. And so they have to offer prices to compete with each other. And so they have to lower their prices, lower the profit margin, maybe even, do those at cost, or maybe even, maybe I wouldn't necessarily say at a loss, but certainly not as a gain that they could have, not as much of a gain, because they have a bunch of other people competing in that space, right? When it comes to airlines, a lot of people have loyalty. That's the one thing I don't have loyalty for, is you never know. Like, an airline could be, getting messed up or have very expensive flights. I feel like you find the greatest difference in prices where some days you're going to fly American, some days United, Southwest, Frontier, Spirit, wherever. It's very hard, in my opinion, to have loyalty to an airline just because of price disparities and price swings. And, I've for instance, I've actually flown from Texas, when I was living in Austin, to Orlando, round trip for two people was $100. Yeah, so it was like $25 a flight. But the next cheapest one for two people round trip from Austin, Texas to Orlando was like $400, which, again, $200 a person for a round trip, not very expensive. Now, I was on Spirit. We didn't check any bags. We didn't have any carry-on. We went for like a 2-day trip to Orlando, so it wasn't like, if we were checking bags, it would have gotten more expensive because they charge a arm and a leg. It's like $60 per bag per way. So there you go. That's the difference. But certainly, there you go. That's certainly something there. So when it comes to loyalty, airlines try to get loyalty, but just as a viewer, maybe you're not loyal. So anyway, they run these flights. Maybe they try to get loyalty, but it's primarily competition. And another thing to add to that is, if I don't know how many of you are aware of, let's say, the Jones Act, for instance. Right, the Jones Act makes it so that foreign companies cannot operate U.S. to U.S. flights. So, for instance, if let's say you have British Airways, they can't do a flight from Orlando to New York and that be the flight. Now, they can do Orlando to New York and then New York to London or wherever the international place is. But the assumption is you start in Orlando and you're going to end up in London. In fact, that would be breaking the Jones Act if they were to knowingly charter people from Orlando to New York, and then have them drop off and then pick people up in New York. In fact, what often happens is that first leg of the flight is mostly empty, right? If let's say they're flying Orlando to London, let's say half the flights from Orlando, half the flights from New York, they go, they can't charter people just for that first half of the flight. They have to leave it empty because of the Jones Act. And so what you often see is, there's less competition, in these regional ones because, one, you don't have international competition. And, two, you would just have lower competition overall. I mean, how many people service, like I mentioned, these other things? So right now, the law that we have in the book, the Jones Act, certainly limits competition in these regional areas just because, only U.S. carriers can go there. So that's one thing. So there you go. And so a lot of people are complaining that, hey, government needs to regulate airlines. What they need to do is open it up, free trade. Hey, let British Airways, let Ryanair, let, all these people run flights in the United States. Like the quality of flights in America, everyone knows is garbage. It's because they have very little outside competition. If you've ever been on an international flight, it's amazing. It's a great experience. They treat you well. They do all this stuff. I've only been on, I think, one that wasn't an American-based airline. I was flying to London one time, and they give you a nice meal, and they do all this very good stuff for you. And it's decently affordable. It's great. They have a ton of competitors in the space because I don't think any other country has a law like the Jones Act. So how many different airlines can fly New York to London? Because again, it's not 2 U.S. cities, it's 1 U.S. city and somewhere else. So there's a lot of competition. So they have to up their game. They have to offer good prices and so on. And so this really comes to the crux of the problem is that, there's a lot of competition in these long flights and there's not competition in these short flights. And so people are saying, hey, regulate it. And I already mentioned that kind of in a loop there. But, hey, let's regulate the flights, make it so that they can only charge per mile or, what have you. And essentially what would happen is you'd lose a ton of flights or the quality would go down. And, in fact, this isn't the first time that this has happened. I saw this story and I wanted to actually talk about this. I read this recently in a book, Freedom to Choose by Milton Friedman. Highly recommend reading it. And I believe it's in chapter 8. Someone could fact check me on that. Protecting the consumer. He talks about this example where when the railways were bustling in this country, there was no regulation on the railways, maybe outside of basic safety measures, but it wasn't on price. It wasn't on anything like that. And what people noticed were that if you were going from, let's say, Baltimore to Cleveland or, Pittsburgh to wherever, short train rides, you were paying more than people going from New York to, let's say, New York to Chicago. And people were upset with that. But the reason that this happened was because of competition, right? There was probably maybe only 1 or maybe 2 rail lines that took you from Baltimore to Cleveland or Pittsburgh to Cleveland, and let's say in that example. But from New York to Chicago, there were probably 5, 6, 7, 8 different routes to get there. And so people would compete that route because it was a very highly traveled route to go because, New York, most populated city. I think at that time, Chicago was the second most populated city. I don't think LA had really, wasn't really big yet. I don't even think it had 1 million people yet in, let's say, the 1880s. Could be mistaken on that one, but I don't think it did. So New York to Chicago were, 2 most populated cities. So tons of people wanted to go on that route. And there was a ton of competition on the route. And so prices became really low. And so, people were upset. They was like, wait a minute, this is half the price to go 5 times the distance. That's crazy. Like, that's unfair. We need to regulate the railroads. And that's exactly what happened. Railroads got uh, well, they got regulated, I think, by the ICC, if I'm not mistaken, and now, or the NHTS or something. They got regulated by someone, and I think they got absorbed by other units and stuff like that. And what ended up happening is transportation by rail slowly but surely, went away. It's not good. Now, I will say airplane travel is a lot better. It's a lot faster. It's a lot more efficient. You don't have to build huge infrastructure. One plane can take you to, a bunch of different cities. You don't have to build track. You just have to build an airport. And then you can accept traffic from anywhere. You don't have to like connect in and have all this crazy line. So from an economical standpoint, airplanes make sense. But because of government regulation, the railway industry for transporting people got decimated because of insane government regulation, and they want to be as fair. They didn't use the word equitable back then, but that was kind of the logic behind it back then. And the overregulation of that industry, along with better technologies coming in, absolutely destroyed it. And so that's what happens. There was a ton of greed in that, and again, there's full details on why people made decisions that they did. Basically, they were able to line their own pockets because of government regulation, and so instead of having to provide a better service to someone at a lower price, it was, hey, well, we can make money in this system, so we're going to do it. Don't actually have to provide anything of value, and I can just let this thing ride and ride and ride. And now our railway system isn't great. It is great for transporting goods, and I think there are fewer regulations on that, especially now. I know in the 90s. So this is another thing I learned in this, is that commercial trucking like had regulations about who could move you from one city to another. I don't believe this is true because I moved, and obviously U-Hauls are a thing now, so you can transport yourself, do a truck, take it wherever you want, or maybe they have licenses for any route. I'm not too sure, but I don't think there's any restrictions. I think that ended in the mid-90s. But up until then, if you were someone that operated a truck, you couldn't just do whatever route you wanted. You had to get licensed to, let's say, do Dayton to Detroit or Oklahoma City to here, or this. Like, each route was heavily regulated, which drove up the cost. And that was an example in the book, was that people moving, you had to get a specific moving truck company to move you from one place to another. And of course, lack of competition and people basically monopolizing, made that very expensive. And that's really what happens with the regulation. So the reason I wanted to reply to this story was that the word that I have is people are going to push for regulation, but all it's going to do is create a monopoly in this space. Because, look, governments are really the only way a monopoly can operate. All the famous examples of monopolies really aren't like, so the big one everyone mentions is Standard Oil. By the time they used the Sherman Antitrust Act against it, was like 10, 15 years after the bill had passed. There were some other smaller ones in more localized areas, but Standard Oil was the big one. Everyone points to, they broke up Standard Oil into like a gazillion different companies, whatever. Standard Oil only had 23% of the market share by that time. They had less than a quarter of the market share. Not even half, not even a majority of the market share then. And so, when it comes to monopolies, really the only ones that exist are government sanctions. So think about if you live in California, for instance, you use San Diego Gas and Electric, Pacific Gas and Electric, PG&E, SDG&E, those companies. Those are government sanctioned monopolies where the government said, hey, look, only you're allowed to operate here. They don't, and the logic behind, let's say, utilities was you didn't want two sets of power lines. You didn't want, three sets of natural gas lines, and I get the logic behind that. But then what happens is these companies have no competition. So, if they have no reason to compete, they're either going to charge a lot of money or they don't have to try hard to give you good services. And another example would be cable. I mean, if you think about how poor cable is, most of the time you had one option for cable provider. Thankfully now, internet, you can get, satellite internet, you can get whatever the Starlink stuff. But most places now you have multiple internet service providers because it's a lot easier to do the fiber and do all that stuff. So for me, when I bought a house, I had the choice between a couple different companies, and they had their different prices, and I was able to purchase one. And they came out, drew the line from the power lines that they had their line on, and rang it to my house, and we were all good. And no problem, whatever. And if I wanted to switch, I would just call the other company and be like, hey, I need you to run some line in my house. They would do the same, and it'd be good. And guess what? Internet speeds are amazing now. Not because you don't have a government sanctioned monopoly. Anyone can put up the line on these power lines. Maybe they have to get some permits or whatnot, but there's a ton of providers in my area. Now you think about rural broadband, the reason that you don't have stuff out there is, one, it doesn't make business sense to go out there because you have to run, let's say, thousands of miles of line of fiber, let's say, for instance, for hundreds or thousands of customers, versus if you do it in a dense city area, you can service potentially hundreds of thousands of customers. And likewise, let's say, so if you're a company, do you really want to run these lines and do this? No. So then the person that is willing to do it, they're incentivized with a higher profit motive. And so that's why rural internet is very expensive to recoup that cost. If they were, let's say, for instance, internet companies were regulated about how much they could charge per, let's say, bandwidth. Let's say, for instance, is, the most you could charge for 50 megabits is $20, or let's say something like that, or $30. Right now, I think I get 300 megabits for 50, so pretty good deal. I'm not going to complain. 300 megabits certainly is good. I can always upgrade. I could probably go to a gigabit. I think it's like $80 for a gigabit. So yes, I pay less per bandwidth unit or less per data rate, but I don't need that kind of internet. I have that choice. But in rural areas, it's very expensive. But let's say they did that regulation, no one would do line out there. There'd be no incentive to do it because the amount of money that you'd have to invest in that project would be tremendous, and the potential payout would be none, right? And so that's what would end up happening is if you get government regulation in, it would stymie growth, or they would not lax. Without a profit motive, less people are going to get services. Less areas are going to be served, and it wouldn't be good. So we get back to this whole monopoly idea. We don't want government monopolies, right? And I feel as if if let's say the government were to re-regulate airlines, then that would happen. And maybe not like, hey, you only have one airline nationally. It would be more of like, hey, if I'm flying from Dallas to Seattle, there's probably only one carrier that could do that, or maybe two. And that's what it would turn into. It would turn into more of the utilities, which, again, people have a lot of dissatisfaction with because there is no competition. What we want is competition, and free markets allow that, because the moment anyone is slacking, the moment, let's say, someone's systems are outdated, the moment there's issues, you raise the prices too much, the quality goes down, someone else will come in and capitalize it. And what I really think the United States should do, and I mentioned this earlier, is get rid of the Jones Act and allow foreign companies to compete in this space, and you would truly keep them accountable, right? And on the airlines thing, I know a lot of people would say, well, they get all this bailout money, they should be regulated. No, I think they just shouldn't get bailout money. I mean, look, during the great financial crisis of 2008, airlines got bailed out. They shouldn't have gotten a nickel. Like, they should have all gone out of business, because here's what happened. After all that money was given to them, you know what they did during the decade of the 2010s? Most of their money went to stock buybacks. And then 2020 happens, and who's the first in line and who's begging for bailouts that, if you don't give us this money, we're going to fire 40,000 people. And, obviously everything matters about the jobs that we have here and all of that. And you have to give us this money. And they did. They caved. They shouldn't have given them a nickel. the good airlines would have survived. They would have either consolidated, new ones would have arisen out of the ashes, and basically they would have been like, hey, well, we can't just put most of our money in stock buybacks. We actually need to save. We need to invest in better technology. We need to have hedges. We need to have this. We need to have that. We need to continually do this, or else we're at risk of, let's say, another black swan event like COVID, for instance. It would certainly, you would go under, because the precedent would be, hey, you're not getting bailed out. You're not getting a nickel. But unfortunately, that's the precedent. So now they spend all loosey-goosey, and so people want regulations because of this. They don't realize that the bailouts are the bad thing, right? People would say, oh, well, they'll get bailed out, and maybe at the time they think it's bad. But then when the airlines do anything they disagree with, they're like, well, you got bailed out, so the government should regulate everything you do. How about leave the airlines alone? And if you truly want them to act well and, not be stupid with their finances and do this, force them to compete against foreign air carriers, right? That's the biggest gripe I have in all of this, because I guarantee you there would be a company, a budget airline, that would come in and see the inefficiencies in the market and capitalize. Think about how many airlines have sprung up in the last 10, 12 years that are at this exact budget. I don't know how old Allegiant Airlines is. I think that's got to be in the last 10, 15 years. Maybe they're older. But they're a budget airline. Think about Spirit. I think they're a little bit older. I don't know if they're the OG budget airline. Maybe on that certainly could be. But you have Allegiant, you have them, you have Frontier. So you have a lot of these quote unquote budget airlines, but these companies find success because they find inefficiencies in the market. And I want to highlight on Allegiant because they understand their target audience, right? Allegiant, if I'm not mistaken, is based out of Las Vegas. And so a lot of people do weekend trips to Vegas. And so they know that, hey, look, most people are only going to have a backpack or a little carry-on or something like that. And so just like the Spirit Airlines, where it's like, hey, look, ticket price is cheap and then everything else is expensive, so too they can do that as well. I also think that Allegiant Airlines maybe have some deals with some of these resorts. I know certainly I think Disney and some of these other companies subsidize flights to Orlando, which is why I got two round-trip tickets for $100. So, I think a lot of these hotels like MGM and whatnot certainly could subsidize these. But again, if it's private businesses subsidizing, it makes sense. But the point that I'm making is that these are just three companies that I mentioned that found inefficiencies in the market and offered, cheaper service. And look, most people don't care about the quality of the flight. They care about, am I going to get from point A to point B safely? Right? That's all they care about. And I think that if you had more eyeballs, more competition on it, you would see much better quality, lower prices, and maybe more diversity in options. And that's another thing that would happen. If, for instance, I know a lot of people in Europe fly Ryanair. I know it's considered a low quality, but there's a reason people fly them. Like, no one forces people to fly Ryanair. They have a rail system. They have other airlines. They have options. But the reason people fly Ryanair is for their case, for their situation. It makes sense. And so, in my opinion, the more competition, the better. And so I look at this case, I see this overall situation where, you have a lot of people pushing for regulation. You have a lot of people saying it's immoral, it's unfair, that's price gouging, it's corporate greed. Yeah, corporations are greedy. All right? They're always going to be greedy. And so people would say, oh, well, then we need to regulate. No, regulating means that people get they're way worse off with regulation. Look at passenger railways and tell me the last time, if you've ever in your life used passenger rail, if you're a resident of the United States. People say, oh yeah, I use Amtrak. No, you don't. No one uses it. All right. It's more expensive. It takes longer. Yeah, sure, you might get some pretty views, but then it's part of the experience versus getting from point A to point B. And so it's a whole different argument versus, hey, look, it could be a lot cheaper, could be a lot better, but it's not. So sorry, I went on a little bit of a rant there on free markets and explaining why this case exists, why the skip lagging is real. And my personal opinion is I don't think it should be illegal. I don't think the government should help airlines enforce it. In fact, I mean, should it be illegal to skip? Like, should it even be legal for for let's say American Airlines to disallow the practice? Well, it's their property, so that's true. But if you're buying a ticket from, let's say, New York to LA or LA to New York, and you have a layover in a city that you ultimately want to go to, do they give you one ticket or two tickets? Most of the time, they're going to give you two tickets. They're going to give you your LA to your stop, your layover, and then a ticket from your layover to New York. So in theory, they gave you those two tickets. You used one of them, but you didn't use the second one. I don't think that should be illegal. Now, look, what airlines could do is make it so that if they stop for a layover and, to pick up maybe more passengers, that you don't get off the plane, that you stay on the plane. That's a way they can enforce it. And then you wouldn't be able to skip lag. You just can't get off the plane. They're only going to accept people on. In fact, I've seen it done where airlines are honest about it, where let's say you buy the first half of a flight. In fact, I don't know if any of you have seen the show It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, but they have a famous episode where they try to drink a bunch of beers. It's Wade Boggs. He's a baseball player who drank, something like 70 beers on a flight, and they do the flight path. And in that, just want to give the example, they stop in Minneapolis and then pick up passengers or drop people off. And some people just got off. Like they bought the whole ticket to LA and didn't seem like, they cared. And some people just stayed on the plane. And then the rest went to Los Angeles. And so, again, if airlines want to stop this, I don't think they should be like, if you do this, you can't use our services. I mean, that's an interesting thing. It is their property. You do agree to not do it, but at the same time, they give you two separate tickets. And so I think the argument that people make is that, hey, look, if let's say I pay for an Uber, or maybe not an Uber is a good example because they have to go to the place, location to get paid, all that stuff. I don't want to, that might be a little convoluted there. But let's say, I pay someone to drive me 100 miles. And then halfway, I say, hey, just drop me off here, you're good. The driver benefits because it's half the time. Actually, you can make an argument it's less than half the time because maybe it's half the time. But, they don't have to use as much fuel. They don't have to use as much of their time to do that. And so the only reason that the airlines care, and in the example, this driver would care, is if the ride was subsidized in some sort of way. And I think that's what's happening. And again, we know with competition, we know with this, but in some way it's subsidized, whether by the airline, by whatever. And so an example would be, let's say there's a taxi cab service or an Uber that says, hey, look, rides to the airport from downtown are going to be $18 flat. Let's just say, sake of argument. Because, it's they work with the airport, they do this, people, whatever the case happens to be, they want to get more rides to the airport. But let's say you live, let's say half a mile from the airport, and the ride would cost you $30 to go to your house that's like on the way to the airport, that's right near you, or maybe you could just say, hey, stop it here, hold up, and then you get out and then walk a couple blocks to your house. You could, in essence, save, let's say, $11, 18 versus $29. And so the ride should have cost $29 because that's where it was, but it was subsidized. And so that's really, I think, the reason why airlines do it, because they subsidize these to pick up customers, to gain that customer loyalty, like I mentioned. And so that's why they care. Because they're not really losing money. You pay for it. They're losing on excess. So in terms of free market, I mean, people, I think should continue doing it. I don't think it should be against the rules or anything like that. But definitely, it's very indicative of competition. I mean, of there being a lack of competition in some of these areas, and there being a lot of competition, and having to actually hold up your own merit there. So it's an interesting situation. I guess the comparison could be made. Did train cars care if you just hopped off at a station? Because certainly they stopped at a station. Let's say New York to Chicago. They stop at, let's say, Pittsburgh. And let's say you buy a ticket from New York to Chicago in the train instance, and you really only want to go to Pittsburgh. Well, you could just buy a ticket from New York to Chicago. It stops in Pittsburgh. You get off. Did they care back then? That would be an interesting thing. Maybe there's some literature on that. Maybe some of you know, and that would be pretty enlightening. But yeah, that would be the truest comparison. Or maybe they didn't stop. Maybe they just had direct routes. I don't know. That would be an interesting case study to compare how companies treated that. Like, you couldn't get off. Whatever. I don't know. Anyway, that's the end of the podcast. I know we spent a lot of time on one topic, but it was kind of indicative of free markets and regulation and monopolies, and it spoken a lot of that. So appreciate you listening, and hope you enjoy. Thank you.